Mr. President, I've come to the floor this evening to speak about legislation that I have recently introduced as chairman of the Indian Affairs Committee, alongside my friend, the Vice Chairman, Schatz. And the bill that we have introduced is the Native Children's Commission Implementation Act. Before I get started with explaining our legislation, I want to recognize the tribal leaders, the elders, the youth, the children, the families who flew in last week for a congressional staff briefing to share their perspectives on the bill, the importance of it, but also to help educate members and staff about the importance of the bill. As events turned out, it was unfortunate that I was not here on that day due to a family emergency back home. But I was able to tune in virtually. It was 5:45 in the morning, Alaska time, and I was able to beam in. And I have to tell you, I can't tell you how proud I was to see the Senate Indian Affairs hearing room. It was packed literally wall to wall, which is it was a reminder to me of how this legislation has captured the attention of so many people who believe Native children deserve every opportunity to thrive. And I was particularly grateful to the tribal leaders, to Native youth, to advocates, to commissioners who traveled from Alaska and across Indian country, all to be there. And I really think that their presence, their stories, their unwavering commitment has really brought this legislation to life. I also want to acknowledge and thank my colleagues, Senator Schatz and Senator Smith, for joining the event and helping to mark this important milestone. Together, they made it clear that this is more than just the introduction of a bill. It is the continuation of a movement that's been built on years of partnership, of perseverance, and on hope. And I want to take a moment to specifically recognize Gloria O'Neill, who chaired the Alice Spotted Bear and Walter Soboleff Commission on Native Children. Gloria and her fellow commissioners devoted years to traveling throughout Indian country. They listened to Native families, and then they brought forward recommendations that are rooted in the voices of the communities themselves. And we owe them a great deal of gratitude for their work. Earlier this year, I joined the Alaska Federation of Natives and Tribal Leaders for a gathering recognizing their work behind this effort. We were upstairs in the Hart building up on the 9th floor, big room filled with Native leaders really from across the country. And I was deeply, deeply honored to be gifted the Mandan name Hotsihe, meaning strong voice. This was gifted to me by Barry Rose Hallam, who is the granddaughter of Alice Spotted Bear. And I was very humbled to receive the name, and I carry it as a reminder of the responsibility that we all share to continue the work that Alice Spotted Bear and so many Native leaders began on behalf of Native children and families. And that responsibility really is at the heart of why this legislation matters so deeply to me. Thousands of bills, we know, are introduced each Congress, and every bill matters to someone, but this one is particularly important to me. And, Mr. President, as I look at you and the chair, I'm reminded of your comments at an energy hearing this morning when you spoke with deep passion and love and care for those children that you didn't know, children who had cancer, and all you wanted to do was to be able to help them with a playground, a place to be happy, a place to feel good about being a child. So I know that you can relate when we talk about important work that we do for our children. The story of how the Native Children's Commission began didn't start here in Washington. It began in tribal communities. It began with parents who wanted better opportunities for their children, and with elders who were determined to preserve their languages and their cultures. And it began with such a great story. It began with young people who stood up in front of hundreds of grown-ups, hundreds of adults, in a convention in Fairbanks years ago. But they had the courage to tell leaders what they were experiencing, and they asked us to do something about it. That, to me, is really where it begins. So more than anything, this bill is about children. Across Indian country, too many Native children experience challenges that no child should have to face. Some have watched their communities suffer from devastating storms or natural disasters. Some have lost loved ones to violence, to addiction, to suicide. Others have entered foster care, and they've struggled to access health care or behavioral health services. Or perhaps they've carried the weight of the boarding school era, which has caused historical trauma that continues to affect families today after subsequent generations. And those experiences are very real, but they are also not the whole story. If there's one lesson that I learned from traveling across my state and meeting with tribal communities across Indian country, it's that resilience is every bit as real as hardship. Native communities possess extraordinary strengths, and their strengths include strong families, vibrant cultures, enduring languages, and generations of wisdom that is passed from elders to the children. And time again, I've watched grandparents teach language to their grandchildren. I've seen parents work tirelessly to create opportunities for that next generation, and elders reminding young people exactly who they are and where they come from. And that sense of identity and culture is so, so powerful. It gives children confidence. It creates belonging. It fortifies our families. And it reminds us that the future of Native children is built not only by overcoming hardship, but by building upon the remarkable strengths that have sustained Native communities for generations. And that understanding has shaped every part of this legislation, whose path began more than a decade ago. I mentioned the Alaska Federation of Natives Convention. This was back in 2013. And during one of the sessions, again, this is the largest gathering of Native people in our state, a group of young leaders, kids from the village of Tanana, stood up before tribal leaders, community members, and elected officials, and they stood on stage, and they spoke with an honesty and a bravery about what they were seeing in their community. They spoke of violence, they spoke of substance abuse and suicide, but what struck me most was not the hardship that they described, it was the hope that they carried with them. And their message was so simple. It was so clear. It was, listen to us. The children were saying, listen to us, and then do something. And I've not ever forgotten those words. Last summer, I heard from Natasha Singh. She is a leader from the Tanana region, and she shared that the chiefs there continue to meet with young people every year. They ask, what progress have we made? What challenges remain? What more needs to be done? What more do we need to do to listen to you? And that kind of accountability is really remarkable, because it reminds us that leadership is not measured by the promises that we make, but whether or not we're willing to answer for them. It also reminded me that if tribal leaders are willing to answer to their children, then Congress should be willing to do the same. So those young people challenged us more than a decade ago, and this new legislation is part of our answer. That conversation that we had in 2013 ultimately led to bipartisan legislation with my friend and former Senator Heidi Heitkamp, and we established the Alice Spotted Bear and Walter Soboleff Commission on Native Children. And the commission had a very straightforward but very important mission, and that was travel throughout Indian country, listen to Native children, listen to the families, to the tribal leaders, to the service providers, the experts, and then come back and tell us here in Congress what is needed to improve outcomes for Native youth. And that's exactly what they did. Over several years, the commissioners visited communities across the country, and they heard some pretty tough stories. They heard some heartbreaking stories, but they also witnessed extraordinary examples of resilience, of innovation, and tribal leadership. And they saw communities creating culturally grounded solutions that were then strengthening families and improving health, supporting children, and really restoring hope. And their work culminated in a report that they called The Way Forward. But that report was never meant to be the end of the conversation. It was only the end of the beginning. And when the commissioners presented their recommendations to our Committee on Indian Affairs, they urged us, they said, please don't let this work become another report that just sits on the shelf and gathers dust. The families who shared their stories deserved more than that. They deserved action. And so that's when we got to work. So over the last couple of years, we've worked closely with tribal leaders, Native organizations, youth advocates, federal agencies, and members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. And we released draft legislation. We held hearings and roundtables. We invited the criticism. We made changes. We refined provisions, added new ideas, and we remained focused on one goal, and that was honoring what Native communities told us they needed. This bill is stronger because it was built with Native communities, not for them. The Native Children's Commission Implementation Act reflects a simple idea, and that is if we want to improve outcomes for Native children, we cannot look at just one issue at a time. And we know when we're talking about kids, you can't talk about life in separate categories. A child does not experience life in neat, clean, separate categories. Health is connected to education. Education is connected to housing. Behavioral health is connected to family stability. Parents cannot succeed if they can't find childcare. Children can't reach their full potential if they're hungry, if they're dealing with untreated trauma or disconnected from language or culture or identity. So our policies should recognize that reality. And we do that within this legislation. It strengthens access to health care and behavioral health services. It supports Native education and language revitalization. It improves juvenile justice, public safety, housing, nutrition, workforce development, and research. And more importantly, it recognizes that tribal communities are best positioned to lead these efforts because they know their children and their families, and they know them better than anyone else. During a hearing earlier this year on our draft legislation, Joan Johnson of the Fort Belknap Indian community shared a story of a young woman who entered the tribe's Tawahi Wellness Program. And the Tawahi Initiative is a pilot program at BIA that assists tribes in providing holistic services that promote everything from child safety to family stability and tribal self-determination. And Fort Belknap testified that their wellness program has removed the stigma of intervention by meeting families in their homes and helping them access care. To understand the need to make this initiative permanent, Joan shared the story of a young woman who had struggled with addiction and homelessness. And the young mother shared, she said, "Tawahi gave me the nudge that I needed. They guided me to become closer to my Creator and helped me learn who I am. And today, that young woman is sober, she's raising her children, and she's helping build a brighter future for her family." And that transformation doesn't happen because Washington has all the answers. It happened because a tribal community invested in one of its own. And we've learned from that, and we're seeking to codify Tawahi as one important section in our legislation. Councilwoman Johnson also described children who came into the Tawahi program knowing they were Native, but not knowing their language, not knowing their traditions, or even their own family stories. And elders helped connect those young people with their identity. They learned their Native names. They participated in ceremony. And many of those same young people eventually became mentors for the children who followed them. So healing became leadership. One generation began lifting the next. We heard similar stories from Alaska, where the Association of Village Council Presidents redesigned the way that families receive services. So instead of forcing parents in crisis, maybe it's addiction, maybe it's homelessness, but it's hard when you have so many disconnected programs. And so through this initiative, they brought education, employment, childcare, family services all together in one place. And so when you've got a family that's just facing so many big, heavy burdens, that kind of coordination can make all of the difference. And these stories, again, remind us that the best ideas rarely begin in Washington. And while I'm proud to get to this point, which is our bill introduction, it's also a reminder that our work is just beginning. This legislation represents more than a decade of listening, learning, and working alongside tribal leaders, Native organizations, families, and young people. And it reflects the belief that lasting change happens when we listen first and legislate second. So while this is an important step, what matters is that we keep moving forward, because every recommendation in the report, which was translated into this bill, began with a conversation in a tribal community. And Mr. President, I'm going to keep coming back to those young people from Tanana because, as I said, it was more than a decade ago they asked us to listen. And I hope today they can see that we are listening, we're acting. The Native Children's Commission Implementation Act is not about creating yet one more federal program or one more report that's going to sit on a shelf somewhere. It's about strengthening what is already working in Native communities. It's about trusting tribal governments, investing in Native families, and ensuring that every Native child, whether Alaska Native, American Indian, Native Hawaiian, has the opportunity to grow up healthy, to grow up safe, connected to their culture, and confident in who they are. And that's a goal that should unite all of us. So today I invite my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats alike, to join Senator Schatz and me as co-sponsors of the Native Children's Commission Implementation Act. Let's show that when tribal communities speak, Congress listens. Let's turn the recommendations of the Way Forward report into meaningful action. And let's work together to build a future where every Alaska Native, American Indian, and Native American and Native Hawaiian child has the opportunity to not only overcome challenges, but to become those leaders of the next generation. So, Mr. President, I look forward to working with you and the rest of our colleagues to do just that. And with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I'd like to address the Senate today regarding a bill that's been passed by the House of Representatives known as H.R. 7008. H.R. 7008 performs two badly needed functions to restore faith and integrity in our system of government. Firstly, it bans members of Congress from using their unique access and knowledge to profit through stock market speculation. Secondly, it requires something very simple, a voter ID. You've got to show an ID when you pick up something at will call, if you're there to pick up tickets at the theater, if you're picking up a prescription at the pharmacy, if you're going to the bank, if you're boarding an airplane, if you're doing all kinds of things that are part of Americans' day-to-day experience, where it matters whether you are who you claim to be, you've got to show an ID. We should require nothing less when it comes to the exercise of one of the most fundamental rights that Americans have. That is their right to vote. You see, when someone else votes in your place, they displace your vote. They offset your vote. If they're double voting, if they're voting when they're not allowed to vote because they're not a citizen or otherwise, if they do something foolish and they try to go and vote, they will be caught if they're asked to produce an ID at the balloting place. So this bill accomplishes both of these things. And like I say, both of them would do a lot to restore faith, confidence, and integrity in our system of government. Dealing specifically with the voter ID requirement in this legislation, this is a very straightforward requirement. When you show up to vote, you just have to show an ID, just like you do at the bank, just like you do at the pharmacy, or the doctor's office, or the bank, or when boarding an airplane. And if you vote by mail, then that's easy to accommodate. You just include a simple photocopy of your photo ID. Now, Mr. President, we've gone to great lengths to make sure that everyone's taken care of here, to make sure that there's not a single U.S. citizen who would be disadvantaged or unable to vote if we were to pass this. So for those who, let's say for whatever reason, don't have access to a photocopier, and they want to vote by mail, well, we've taken that into consideration. The bill requires states to provide the public with free access to photocopy machines so that they can make a photocopy of their photo ID and send it in with their mail-in ballot if that's what they're using in their state. Now, Mr. President, it's interesting. Right now, the headquarters of the Democratic Party here in Washington, D.C., displays a sign very prominently. And that sign makes clear that 100% of the visitors to the Democratic Party's headquarters have to show a photo ID when they enter. Now, if they have to do that, and we know they have to do that when attending the Democratic National Convention, to enter the convention hall, much less participate as a voting member of the Democratic National Convention, you have to prove who you are, and you have to show that you have the right to be there and the right to participate. So far be it from us to second-guess the Democratic Party in deciding that people need to prove who they are to enter their convention hall or their party headquarters. We should have voters do the same thing. The Democrats are smart in doing that because, after all, they don't want somebody showing up to their convention. I mean, good heavens, what if a Republican showed up to their Democratic National Convention and tried to skew the results of their convention by pretending to be a Democrat delegate, no less? That wouldn't be fair. So they're absolutely right to require photo ID and to require delegates to present their convention credentials so that they can show that they are who they claim to be and that they have the right to participate at their own convention. Mr. President, Americans at every corner of our country and at every point along the political ideological spectrum in this country agree that this makes sense to do, specifically in the context not just of needing to produce ID where it matters whether you are who you claim to be, but specifically in the context of voter ID, of having to produce identification at the moment you vote, at the place where you vote. 83% of American voters in total support voter ID. And that includes, Mr. President, a whopping 71% of Democrat voters. So this is neither Republican nor Democratic. This is neither liberal nor conservative. This is simply an American issue because we don't want anyone's right to vote to be taken away. We don't want anyone disenfranchised. And that, Mr. President, is exactly what happens when you allow someone who is not who they claim to be, who is not entitled to vote, to show up and cast a vote, and that's wrong. So today we've got a really good opportunity to address these two issues that Americans are deeply concerned about, and I hope we can take advantage of this opportunity. Now, the vote on the House of Representatives side of this bill, like I say, it was just passed recently by the House of Representatives. It was bipartisan. You had Republicans overwhelmingly support it, but you also had a number of House Democrats voting with every House Republican in favor of this bill with the clean voter ID requirement attached. So we're going to be talking about this for a little while tonight, and I just want to encourage my Democrat colleagues on this side of the Capitol, right here in the United States Senate, to follow the lead of the wise Democrats who joined every Republican to vote for this in the House of Representatives. We need to get this done. We should get it done. We have the opportunity to get it done tonight, and we'll be talking more about that in a moment. Thank you, Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from Alaska.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to commend my colleague, Senator Lee, and my colleague, Senator Ricketts, Senator Moreno, we're all on the floor to seek unanimous consent to a bill that actually just makes common sense. Senator Lee talked about the different provisions of the bill, but Mr. President, I think one thing that's important to underscore is it just passed the House. These are issues that are on the minds of the American people, and it passed the House in a bipartisan manner, a strong bipartisan manner. So I'm hopeful that we can move that House bill on both of these issues that Senator Lee just talked about in a way tonight and get this bill to the President's desk. As I mentioned, Mr. President, common sense. Senator Lee talked about the insider trading provisions. I think every American would agree that members of Congress should be prohibited, as well as their spouses and children, from purchasing individual stocks while serving in office, particularly given that we have access to different kinds of information. This has been something that I've done a number of years ago, moved stocks into index funds to kind of get rid of this issue from my perspective. Personally, Senator Ricketts has been the lead here in the U.S. Senate on this issue. I'm actually a co-sponsor of his bill that is very much focused on this common sense approach to the issue of insider trading. And then we need to go to the issue of integrity of our election system. As Senator Lee pointed out, it makes sense. It's very, very common sense, Mr. President, simple in many ways, that if you're going to vote, you have to have a valid ID to do that. Now, this bill mandates that requirement, but it has a lot of provisional elements to this bill that accommodate states like mine that are very big, that have a dispersed population. So this bill includes those kind of accommodations, Mr. President. Eligible voters can access a provisional ballot. They can sign an affidavit attesting to their identity and citizenship if they don't have an ID. There are many ways in which this bill accommodates the important element of making sure that American citizens vote in American elections. And I don't think that's some kind of radical idea, Mr. President. I think the vast, vast majority of Americans agree with this. So I want to thank my colleagues for their leadership on this issue, and I'm hopeful that our colleagues on the other side of the aisle will agree with us. And let's pass this bill and send it to the President's desk. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. President. Integrity. Integrity inspires confidence. And the reverse is true. If there's a perception of lack of integrity, it undermines confidence. And Mr. President, we have a problem here in the Congress. 80% of Americans believe that we do not do a good job of separating our financial interests from the insider information that we receive as part of our jobs. And because of this perception of lack of integrity, they don't think we're doing a good job, our approval rating is 15%. Clearly, Americans are not trusting this institution on this issue. But we have an opportunity to course correct, to help restore the integrity and therefore the confidence that Americans have in the U.S. Congress. And that's by passing H.R. 7008. That includes the Stop Insider Trading Act that was introduced in the House and passed, as my colleagues pointed out, with bipartisan support. I introduced the companion bill here in the Senate. What this bill does is says you cannot buy stocks when you get here. Well, why is this important? Because we have disclosure laws right now, but yet we have the problem that 80% of Americans think that we do a bad job of keeping our financial interests and our insider information separate. And indeed, we see people post on social media, for example, the stock trades of the former Speaker of the House. And it's become a legitimate trading strategy, as crazy as it sounds, because it's successful. It makes money. We've had a situation in the past where one of the members of the Intelligence Committee sold about $1.5 million worth of stock right before the stock market tanked because of COVID. Even the perception of using insider information to benefit yourself financially is undermining the confidence. And the same could be said as well for the voter ID. 36 states have voter ID. In my state of Nebraska, when I was governor, we passed it and put it on the ballot. It passed overwhelmingly, 65-35. The Nebraskans wanted to have that voter ID as part of the process of elections to make sure they could trust in the integrity and have confidence. Now, the Insider Trading Act has real teeth to it. It says that you cannot buy stock, and if you own stock already when you come into the Congress, you can only sell it on 7 to 14 days' notice. Why is this important? Well, to make sure that the market and anybody in the country can see that if you are going to sell your stock positions, they can all do it first. They get that information first, so that if you have some sort of insider information, it's not insider anymore because the rest of the world knows. And if you do violate the rules, either you buy stock or you sell stock out of turn without giving the proper notification, significant penalties. A minimum $2,000 fine or 10% of the transaction cost. So, for example, if you sold $1 million worth of stock, that's a $100,000 fine, plus giving up all the profits that go along with it. That has the enforcement and the teeth that require members of this body and members of the House to take notice. This bill would go a long way toward restoring the integrity of this institution, restoring the confidence in this institution. And as was mentioned already, it passed bipartisan in the House. But the President has called on us to pass it, and recently the Vice President, when he was speaking to House Republicans. Let's restore the faith in this institution. Let's make sure people know that we are not using our inside information to financially benefit ourselves. Coming to Washington, D.C. to serve our communities is a privilege. We do it for public service. It is not to be a profit center for people who are coming here. So let's make sure there's no perception possible by passing H.R. 7008. So, Mr. President, as if in legislative session and notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.R. 7008, which was received from the House. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be reconsidered and made and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection?
Mr. President,
Chair recognizes the senator from California.
reserving the right to object. Mr. President, it's a shame that Senate Republicans seem singularly focused on scoring political points instead of passing real policies that can actually make a difference. Because yes, all Americans, Democrats, Republicans, and independents alike, are rightly concerned about insider trading by government officials. But the bill before us cannot address these concerns because just like as was the case on Monday, that's right, 48 hours ago, we were having the same discussion, the same debate. This measure contains two giant poison pills. First, it exempts the president and the vice president of the United States for that matter, but it exempts the president from this ban on stock trading. And I can list at least 21,000 reasons why we should not exempt the president from the ban on insider trading. Last year alone, Donald Trump made over 21,000 stock trades, an average of 85 trades per day. 85! Does that sound like somebody that's singularly focused on bringing costs down for hardworking Americans? I don't think so. As I also said on Monday, Donald Trump is clearly the trader-in-chief. So you cannot be serious about reining in public official stock trading if you present a bill that gives the biggest stock trader in Washington a free pass. A colleague from Nebraska spoke to the virtues of disclosure and advance notice. On the surface, that seems very attractive. Let me tell you what's really going on. President Trump's social media company is publicly selling inside information about his market-changing statements before the public sees them to hedge funds and Wall Street for the low price of $100,000 a month. It's all in the open. Inside information from the president himself for $100,000 a month. The average American earns less than that in a year. But the president isn't worried about them. He's focusing on profiting from his office. So it's clear that Republicans in Congress are not actually serious about banning stock trading where it's happening the worst. And they're not about helping working Americans address the higher costs of gas and groceries and housing and health care. So what is it that they do care about? Let's talk about the other big poison pill in this bill, because the title of it seems like it's about insider trading, Stop the Insider Trading Act. But the way it's before us includes the SAVE Act, a bill that we've debated for months and months and months on this floor. Republicans don't have the votes to pass it. A bill that would make it harder for eligible Americans to participate in our democracy. We've debated this bill for months, and it's gone nowhere because the Republican caucus isn't even united on this measure. Because the bill, it's not about voter fraud. The massive voter fraud they claim simply doesn't exist. There's no evidence of massive voter fraud across the country. What the SAVE Act proposal does do is it shows distrust in our system and seeks to cause chaos in an election cycle that's already underway. A midterm election, by the way, where Republicans are afraid of voters holding them accountable for failing to do anything about rising costs and increased corruption, let alone this unauthorized war with Iran. How do we know that? Because the SAVE Act, as written, is far more restrictive than the voter ID laws that exist in the states that already have a voter ID law. The House Republican bill would go further and require a photocopy of your ID in your absentee or mail ballot. Now that violates the fundamental premise of a secret ballot, which is a sacred right. And therefore, it would undermine mail voting itself. As I mentioned on Monday, the Republican governor of Ohio vetoed a similar bill because he saw no benefit in it and that the measure would, quote, be a significant burden on voters. So that's truly the point of the bill, to make it harder for some people to vote. Now, let's get back to the title of the bill, Stop Insider Trading. If we're genuine about doing that, then, Mr. President, there's a bipartisan solution that is available to us today. A bipartisan solution on stock trading. Right, everybody watching at home. There's a bill that's been pending before the Senate for nearly a year. The Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee voted it out on a bipartisan basis. Senator Hawley is the lead sponsor. Senator Moreno is a co-sponsor along with a number of Democrats. S. 1498, the Halting Ownership and Non-Ethical Stock Transactions, or otherwise known as the Honest Act. So let's pass that, or at least set up a vote on that measure. And if Republicans aren't willing to do that, then let's sit down, Republicans and Democrats together, to hammer out a real solution and stop with these political games. So therefore, Mr. President, I ask that the senator modify his request to instead proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar item number 294, as 1498, that the committee reported substitute amendment be agreed to, the bill as amended be considered read a third time and passed, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection to the modification?
Mr. President,
Chair recognizes the senator from Ohio.
so I think it's important to clear up a couple things in no particular order. First of all, I did not co-sponsor the Honest Act. I was the co-sponsor of the Pelosi Act, which was a tribute, an honor to the member of the House of Representatives that made grift on this job an absolute masterclass. Your representative from Northern California came here almost 5 decades ago and has managed to build a $300 million net worth. Her Twitter account is one of the most followed accounts, as my colleague from Nebraska pointed out. So I was very proud to sponsor the Pelosi Act. In fact, it's extraordinarily similar to the exact same measure my colleague from Utah, my colleague from Nebraska have proposed, as have you, my colleague from Ohio. So just to clear that up. Now, then the next question was, well, why would you not sponsor a bill called the Honest Act? I mean, my God, how do you be anti-honest? Well, that bill basically bans the ownership of all assets. You can't even own them. So if you have mutual funds, stocks, equities, investments, you have to get rid of all that. So basically, that would be insane. There's no other way to look at that. The Democrats put that in place during a Homeland Security meeting, which went something along like this. We sat down to talk about the Pelosi Act, and they gave us 15 pages of amended documents, said, hey, we're going to vote on this right now. And again, I should have predicted it, honestly, because it was a tribute to Nancy Pelosi, who said, well, you have to vote for the bill before you know what's in it. Of course, Republicans said, we're not going to vote for something we haven't read, because, again, that's insane. But it wasn't as insane as what is actually in that bill. Now, let's go back to what we're really doing here tonight. We could pass this today. Tomorrow, the President of the United States could sign into law a ban on insider trading. This is a 100% zero issue. Sometimes we talk about 80-20 issues. There's not an American citizen, well, it's maybe Paul Pelosi, who would be against this. But all Americans want us to get this done, and it's very common sense. My colleague from Nebraska worked diligently on this. It's a great bill. It says if you own stocks when you get here, you can't buy more, so therefore you can't use the information. And you can't sell stocks without a 7-day notice period, which in effect eliminates any kind of advantage that you would have. Very good bill, applies to all members of Congress. We should be able to get that done. We should be able to ban insider trading without Democrats blocking that vote. And my colleague, I believe, from Nebraska, if you could ask him, Mr. President, I want to be clear, he's asked for a vote at 60. Is that correct, Mr. President?
That's correct.
So that would,
Hold on.
Not on this consent.
Not on this consent.
okay. So I would ask unanimous consent that we do that this bill is objected, sorry. Okay. Well, let me just continuing. So let's talk about voter ID really quickly. My colleague from California said that Republicans are not united on voter ID. That's absolutely, positively false. This is really important because you can't make accusations here that are false. My colleague from Ohio, the presiding officer, has put forward the exact, in essence, voter ID bill, and it was 53 out of 53 Republicans that voted for that. 53 out of 53. That is 100% of Republicans. If I did that math correctly, I believe that 53 of 53 is 100%. Where he is correct is that Democrats are united in their opposition. There wasn't a single Democrat that voted for a standalone voter ID bill. Tonight, we have the opportunity to do that. Ban insiders trading and get voter ID on the floor. And because my colleagues don't want to do what the American people want them to do, I object.
Objection is heard to the modification. Is there an objection to the original request?
I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President,
Chair recognizes the senator from Nebraska.
what we were just attempting to do was to pass a unanimous consent. That means all 100 senators agree that we can move forward on H.R. 7008, which includes the Stop Insider Trading Act and the voter ID. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, this is about integrity. Integrity inspires confidence. 80% of Americans don't believe we separate our inside information from our financial interests. And therefore, we have a 15% approval rating. It is the lack of confidence in what we're doing about how we're handling this that is creating those low ratings. And so we have an opportunity to be able to address that with the Stop Insider Trading Act and the voter ID to restore that integrity and therefore that confidence. But I certainly understand that if my colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't wish to do that unanimously, that for whatever reason somebody objects going forward, as my colleague from California has, I offer an alternative that let's schedule a vote. So as if in legislative session, and notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that at a time to be determined by the majority leader in consultation with the Democratic leader, the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.R. 7008 and vote on the passage of the bill at a 60-vote affirmative threshold. Further, that if the bill is passed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection?
Reserving the right to object.
Chair recognizes the senator from California.
Mr. President, before I offer a good faith counterproposal to my colleague from Nebraska, let me just clarify one item, because our colleague from Ohio seemed to be correct, or attempting to correct, I should say, a measure that I was referencing. So to folks watching at home, let me suggest don't take my word for it. Go to congress.gov and look up S 1498. And you will see that indeed Senator Moreno is a co-sponsor. And if you read the measure itself, you will see that it does not ban mutual fund investments. And with that true correction and clarification, Mr. President, let me ask that the senator modify his request to instead, at a time to be determined by the majority leader in consultation with the Democratic leader, the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar item 254, S 1498, the committee reported substitute amendment be agreed to, and the Senate vote on passage of the bill at a 60-vote affirmative threshold. Further, that if the bill is passed, the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection to the modification?
Mr. President,
Chair recognizes the senator from Ohio.
reserving my right to object, the bill that my colleague from Nebraska, my colleague from Ohio, my colleague from Utah are proposing is a bill that's already passed the House of Representatives. It's got massive bipartisan support. Lots of Democrats voted for that in the House. If we pass it, it can become law. Putting that bill on the floor at 60 is a very low threshold ask. I think the American people deserve to know how each member of this chamber decides to do on banning insider trading and voter ID. The proposal that my colleague from California is putting on the floor is a bill that has neither gone through any committee, where it's been actually read by committee members. It is a bill that has not been presented to the House of Representatives, so they would have to take it up over there. It would, of course, be modified and come back. In other words, it's what I say, it's the DC two-step. You want to be able to have a headline that says, I'm for banning insider trading, knowing nothing will actually happen. Now, maybe you don't think the bill that my colleague from Nebraska worked diligently on is perfect, but it is a massive step in the right direction. This would get us to 99.9% of the way there on banning insider trading. It could happen tomorrow. It could happen tomorrow. And the voter ID law, which virtually all Americans support, could happen tomorrow. So what we're dealing with is one bill that can be signed into law, that's been vetted, that's massive bipartisan support, versus a bill that, quite frankly, the person talking about it wasn't even on that committee, is not 100% sure it was in that bill, doesn't know the history of the bill, because it wasn't a year ago, it was a few months ago. It is a smokescreen, and for that reason, I object.
Objection is heard. Is there an objection to the original request?
Mr. President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from Utah.
Mr. President, we see a lot of debates around here on a lot of different topics. Too many topics, in my view, given the fact that the federal government is government enterprise with narrow responsibilities. In Federalist 45, James Madison described the powers of the federal government as few and defined, while reserving those to the, describing those reserved to the states as numerous and indefinite. We're in charge of national defense, weights and measures, trademarks, copyrights, and patents, regulating trade or commerce between the states with foreign nations and with the tribes, bankruptcy laws, intellectual property laws, postal roads, declaring war, granting letters of marque and reprisal, serving as the sole sovereign lawmaking authority for what we now call the District of Columbia, the city where we stand today. That's about it. There are a few other powers, but the lion's share of it can be found somewhere in that list of relatively limited authorities that I just described. We venture sometimes too far afield from those powers, and that's one of the reasons why a lot of things come up. My point in reciting all this is that in all the debates we see, which probably range farther than they should, we see some things that are weighty, some things that are more on the trivial side. Just to cite one random hypothetical, you can, 1 minute you can see something debated and maybe passed on this floor, recognizing, I don't know, National Sofa Care Week or something like that. It goes by sort of with a yawn. Then the next moment, you'll be debating something more weighty, something more significant and more definitely relevant to the U.S. government's powers. Now, under Article 1, Sections 4 and 5, this legislation that we've been discussing this evening, H.R. 7008, it deals with a couple of core powers that Congress has, one of them involving the regulation of behavior and activities on the part of members of Congress, of members of the House and the Senate. In the second instance, you have the regulation of the casting of ballots for federal elections, for federal office, elections for U.S. Senate and U.S. House of Representatives. We certainly have authority to act in both of those two areas. There's not a lot of dispute. In other words, there's a lot of bipartisan consensus over the fact that it's time to restrict stock buying and selling on the part of members of Congress. It is stunning, however, that the voter ID component of H.R. 7008 is at all controversial. Mr. President, this one should be a no-brainer. For the American people, it is a no-brainer. Democratic voters, 71% favor voter ID requirements. When you add Republicans, so Democrat voters, Republican voters combined, you take it up to 83, 84%. If you poll Republican voters alone, we're talking in the mid to high 90 percentile range for people who support voter ID requirements. And the reason for this is simple. This is obvious. It's intuitive. Just as we have to prove who we are everywhere else we go, where who you are matters and whether you are who you claim to be can make a big difference. Americans intuitively understand that whatever mild inconvenience might accompany having to provide documentation for who you are, and most of the time that can be done with a simple card, a driver's license, for example, a passport, something like that, something showing who you are that's issued by the government. We've come to accept as a society that that's just sort of the cost of living in our country. That's part of what it takes, because if we didn't do that, the alternative would be bad. You don't want to show up to your bank one day and discover that somebody else impersonating you, falsely claiming to be you, came in and withdrew all of your money. You don't want that. We don't allow people to board aircraft without a photo ID. And the reason is there are all kinds of things that can happen in the sky that are dangerous. And you don't want to make it too easy for somebody claiming to be who they are not, boarding an aircraft, and then carrying out, crimes of one sort or another, acts of terrorism, perhaps. So these are just a couple of examples of the myriad instances in which we have to prove who we are. It's not an undue burden. It's a momentary detour from what we would otherwise be doing. Most of the time, most people, when they show up to vote, already have their wallet with them. And in their wallet, they presumably have a driver's license or another form of government-issued photo ID. So why not require them to show that? We saw tonight my friend and colleague, the distinguished senator from California, contorting himself into a pretzel, trying to explain why it is that we can't pass this bill. And to be clear, his objection, as far as I can tell, didn't relate nearly as much to anything else in the bill other than the voter ID provision. That's the concern. The question is, why is it that when 70% of Democrat voters and 83, 84% of all voters, Democrat and Republican combined, why is it that my Democrat colleagues are so adamantly opposed to this? Why do they care? Why do they want the status quo? I'm always reluctant to speak on someone else's behalf because what they say, number one, I don't have the ability to read minds, but sometimes what they say can give us an indication. Mr. President, we've had Democratic politician after Democratic politician part from their own Democratic voter base, which overwhelmingly supports voter ID, time and time and time again, showing up and saying, oh, we don't want voter ID. Why? Now, they actually say this. We believe that this would shut out a lot of our voters. What? Is that an admission that a lot of their voters aren't who they claim to be? That a lot of their voters perhaps aren't U.S. citizens and aren't eligible to vote? This ought to be concerning to everyone. It ought to be concerning, especially to Democrat voters, especially in states that have elected a Democrat senator who is now opposing any and every sort of voter ID requirement. A few months ago, Mr. President, when we had the Save America Act on the floor for, I don't know, 10 blessed days, should have been longer, but it was on the floor for about 10 days. During that time, I was on the floor a lot, responding to arguments that they made. And I think I heard every single argument that they made. The overwhelming majority of them, and I mean probably 95+% of the arguments that they made against the Save America Act weren't even against the voter ID provisions of the Save America Act. Overwhelmingly, they were instead about the proof of citizenship issue. In fact, many of them, Democratic senator after Democratic senator, intimated one way or another that they're okay with voter ID requirements. So why are they opposing it? You have to ask yourself that question. In Latin, there's a word for this, cui bono. Who benefits? Who benefits, Mr. President, from people being able to show up and claim to be someone they are not, or from someone showing up who is not entitled to vote because they're not a U.S. citizen? Who benefits from that? I can tell you it's not Republicans. Why? Well, you don't see a single Republican politician making the ridiculous, absurd arguments against voter ID and citizenship verification that these guys are making. Who benefits from illegal voting? Their words seem to suggest that they're benefiting. Mr. President, this issue isn't going away. The Save America Act isn't going away. Voter ID requirement demands are not going away. I will be back. I will be back day after day, week after week, until this passes. Because the American people deserve to go to bed every night knowing that their government is run by people they themselves elected. Not foreign nationals. They don't want a government that has been chosen with significant foreign influence in our elections. There was a time, Mr. President, when the Democrats in this august chamber, a time not so very long ago indeed, spoke of little else other than their fear of foreign election interference. Mr. President, if we don't face a real challenge as to foreign election interference right now, as long as we are not passing the Save America Act or its key components, it would appear that those who are against this are just fine now with foreign election interference. The American people shouldn't be. Because again, it's not free. When somebody else votes who's not who they claim to be, when somebody else votes claiming to be a citizen and they're not a citizen, it robs hardworking Americans, actual American citizens, of their most sacred, their most fundamental right, their right to vote. No, Mr. President, we can't look the other way. Nor do we, in my view, have any business taking a 6-week recess until such time as we've done everything humanly possible to get these reforms put into law. The American people deserve better than this. Most of them don't have that luxury of doing that. No, I know it's a time-honored Senate tradition. I know it's a tradition that has its roots back to long before the advent of modern air conditioning, to a time when Washington, D.C., it's typically not the most pleasant weather in Washington, and this chamber, I'm sure, became suffocatingly hot and muggy. So for a long time, we had that August recess. Well, we have air conditioning now. We can handle it. Now it's true. We frequently do take a recess in August. But it's not written in stone anywhere. It's not written in law anywhere that we have to do that. I'd be fine doing that if we'd gotten our work done. I'd be fine doing that if we knew how our government was going to be funded past September 30th. Right now, we have no idea. So when the government remains unfunded, and we have no idea how we're going to secure an election system that, quite frankly, is recklessly, criminally insecure, we have no business leaving this chamber for 6 weeks when we have no idea how we're going to take care of any of that. These problems are not going to solve themselves while we're gone. I remember 15 years ago, when I was first sworn in. I was younger then. I had a full head of hair. I was only 39 years old. I was the youngest member of the Senate when I got sworn in. Right after I got sworn in, we were walking around one evening around the Capitol, showing it to my family. My daughter Eliza, my daughter Eliza was 10 years old at the time. She pointed to one of these little doors out in the hallway, just outside the Senate chamber. It's a door that's maybe 18 inches tall at the most. I later learned that it was installed when they built this wing of the Capitol in the late 1850s. That was their source of water. They had a pipe in there, and the custodial staff at the time used it to get water so that they could clean the floors. I didn't know that at the time, and as we were walking around, my 10-year-old daughter Eliza asked me, Dad, what's that door for? And, not knowing how to answer, I just said the first thing that came to mind, and I said, well, that's for the house elves. The house elves live in there. Mr. President, of course, there are no house elves here, but sometimes we act as if we're relying on the house elves to not only clean the Capitol, but also clean up the messes we make and that we leave undealt with, unaddressed legislatively while we're gone. The cavalry is not coming. We are the cavalry. The house elves aren't going to show up and do our work for us if we retreat into the sunset for 6 weeks. We have to do this. We had an opportunity tonight to make a meaningful dent in our election security problem. And it is tragic that the Democrats chose not to let this reasonable measure pass into law, a measure that 71% of their voters, 83% of all American voters support. They can't handle it, apparently because they benefit too much when people vote illegally. Shame on them for taking that position, but shame on us if we leave before the job is done. Lastly, Mr. President, far too much gets said around here about, we can't do X, Y, or Z because we don't have 60 votes. I get that. I get that that is said. That cannot become our anthem. That is an absurd suggestion. Now, I know it takes 60 votes to invoke cloture. But, long before there even was a cloture rule, there's only been a cloture rule for 109 years. Before that time, we still had the filibuster, just no cloture. Remember, a cloture vote is just one way of breaking the filibuster. If a supermajority of senators, under the current rules, it's 3/5, or 60 votes in the Senate, 60 senators want to force debate to come to a close, even if some senators want to continue debating, then the Senate can do so. But, Mr. President, that is not the exclusive means by which you can break a filibuster. Other techniques are available, techniques that were available for nearly 150 years before the first cloture rule was even adopted in 1917. If you can't break a filibuster and you don't have 60 votes to bring debate to a close, using cloture, you can put legislation on the floor and you can debate it. And you can require any senator wishing to filibuster to continue to show up and continue to speak to prolong debate. But, Mr. President, the filibuster is about speaking. It's about debate. It is not about perpetually forestalling the passage of legislation until you have 60 votes for it. Passage in this chamber, with rare exceptions not relevant here, is set at a simple majority, at 51 votes. And if the vice president's with you, you can do it at 50 votes. The vice president supplies the tie-breaking vote of 51, and then it's passed. We could do that. We should be putting this measure on the Senate floor. We should be debating it for weeks on end, if necessary, cutting into weekends and long scheduled recess time, if necessary, making clear we're going to keep debating it until it passes. And making clear that the minute those filibustering it fail to show up and continue to speak, we will call the question. And we will pass it with a simple majority. We could do that. We should do that. It takes time, yes, but, time's on our side. We've got weeks in which to do this. We should do that. Now, if we don't want to do that, there are other mechanisms available to us. We could continue to attach it to other must-pass vehicles. We could also push something in the form of budget reconciliation. Now, that's a little trickier. You can bypass the need for cloture with budget reconciliation, but it has to be budgetary, and it has to meet a whole bunch of requirements. It has to be budgetary, meaning it brings about changes in mandatory outlays or revenues, and it can't, among other things, have budgetary features that are merely incidental to policy changes. But there are ways we could capture some of the benefits of the Save America Act through reconciliation. Look, my point is just to say there are multiple ways of skinning this cat. I don't care nearly as much which way we skin him. I personally prefer to bring it up on the floor and debate it until it passes. I think that's the cleanest way of doing it, but I'm not a purist on that. I don't insist that it be my way or the highway. I'm just saying we do have to do it. We can't pretend this isn't there. This will not disappear simply because we leave. The cavalry's not coming. We are the cavalry. There are no house elves who will come in and fix our election security problems. So let's get this done, and for the love of all that is sacred and holy, let's not go on a 6-week recess with all of this undone. The American people deserve better. Thank you, Mr. President.